Welcome back, everyone. In previous videos, we've seen that the Quran is not a revelation from God at all. Rather, it's largely a collection of prior tradition, legend, and folklore. But the Solomon stories in the Quran give us an especially concentrated mixture of all sorts of legendary material. As an example, we've discussed how Surah 2744 is a small sliver of ancient mystical tradition jammed into the story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Similarly, the stories about Solomon controlling the wind, employing devils to dive for pearls and help build the temple, borrow from other legendary material like that preserved in the Testament of Solomon. But the borrowing doesn't stop there. The compilers of the Quran needed even more legendary material to complete their stories about Solomon. So let's look at another very interesting example. We'll go to the Talmud, where we are introduced to a demon named Ashmedai. One day when Solomon was alone with Ashmedai, Solomon said, "How come you're better than we are?" Ashmedai said to Solomon, "Take the chain off me and give me your ring, and I'll show you." Ashmedai swallowed him and then spat him out. Now, the Talmud can be very difficult reading for the uninitiated, so let's go to Ginsburg. He gives this to us in more of a narrative format. One day Solomon told Ashmedai that he did not understand wherein the greatness of the demons lay, if their king could be kept in bonds by a mortal. Ashmedai replied that if Solomon would remove his chains and lend him his magic ring, he would prove his own greatness. Solomon agreed. The demon stood before him with one wing touching heaven and the other reaching to the earth. Snatching up Solomon, who had parted with his protecting ring, he flung him 400 parasangs away from Jerusalem, and then palmed himself off as the king. Then what happened? Well, Solomon spent some years as a beggar before he was recognized by some Jewish officials that we'll talk about later. He was given his magical ring and regained the throne as the demon fled. One said Solomon was king, commoner, then king again. One more important detail from this story is the sin of Solomon. For 3 long years, Solomon journeyed about, begging, atoning for the 3 sins of his life, by which he had set aside the commandment laid upon kings in Deuteronomy, not to multiply horses and wives and silver and gold. And you know what happens next? Let's go to the Quran. "And we certainly tried Solomon and placed on his throne a body. Then he returned in repentance. He said, 'My Lord, forgive me and grant me a kingdom such as will not belong to anyone after me. Indeed, you are the bestower.'" These 2 short verses in the Quran provide us with some significant parallels to the mystical traditions that we've just seen in the Talmud. In both cases, Solomon is tested. The second item, the binding and unleashing of Ashmedai, is absent in these 2 verses, but we'll talk about that later. A body is placed on his throne in the Quran, and Ashmedai assumes the throne in the Talmud. Solomon humbly returns in repentance in the Quran and wanders as a beggar. Once again, the common theme of humility. Solomon asks for forgiveness for sins, and in the Talmud, he spent 3 years wandering for his 3 sins. Solomon regains the kingdom then in both accounts. And regarding that missing parallel of binding demons, we don't have to look far in the Quran. A couple of verses later in the same surah, Solomon had devils, and they were his builders and divers bound together in shackles. Why is it that so many times when we look at the Quran, supposedly the word of Allah, we actually see the words of prior tradition and legend instead? Muhammad's critics were right. It's no wonder they called him an ear. I would suggest another good description would be a sponge. Muhammad the sponge absorbed all kinds of legendary material, and it seems his revelations consisted of a demon in a cave squeezing them back out of him. Speaking of Muhammad's revelations, let's figure out how they worked. He would wrap himself in a garment and move his lips quickly with inspiration and sweat on a cold day. He would even hear the ringing of a bell and snort like a camel. All this to receive revelations that were already well known, in this case from prior Jewish tradition. If mankind and jinn gathered in order to produce the like of this Quran, they couldn't do it. But as it turns out, it doesn't take a whole lot of people and jinn. It just takes a couple of Jews and their Talmud, which, by the way, Allah consistently confuses with the Torah. And this is one problem we've seen over and over in these videos. The author of the Quran shows no knowledge of the sources that he's borrowing from. So let's help him out and believe in what I have sent down, confirming that which is already with you in the Talmud. He has sent down upon thee the book with the truth, confirming what was before it, and he sent down the life of Adam and Eve. And this is one of my favorites. He will teach him the book of the Cave of Treasures, the Testament of Solomon, Genesis Rabbah, and the Protevangelium of James. Surah 350, and I have come confirming what was before me of Jewish mystical tradition, and to make lawful for you some of what was forbidden to you. Surah 544, surely we sent down the legend of Alexander the Great, wherein is guidance and light. Other than Allah showing no knowledge of his sources, there is the problem of historicity. You can see that the story about Solomon falls roughly in the middle of several other narratives that are clearly believed in the Quran to be historical people and events. To name a few, we have Noah, Pharaoh, the people of Lot, David, Solomon, Job, and Abraham. That the Quran takes this as historical material is confirmed from the larger context and also the immediate context. Notice what Surah 38:34 says, and we certainly tried Solomon and placed on his throne a body. There's a major problem here. The Solomon story in the Quran has been separated from its original midrashic mystical context and imported into the Quran as a standalone story. It's its own complete narrative. But when we go back to the sources that the Quran is borrowing from, we see that this was not historical at all. Notice what the Talmud says. Solomon would make his rounds begging. We talked about this before, and here's that detail about the Jewish leaders I said we would come back to. When Solomon came to the Sanhedrin, there were demonstrably no Sanhedrin in Solomon's time. But this historical anachronism doesn't bother the rabbis, and it doesn't bother their audiences. And it doesn't bother them because they all realize what they're doing is midrash. They're not trying to do history per se, so they're not concerned with these sorts of details. Rather, they're concerned with telling stories that are understandable to people in their time around the late Second Temple period that communicate important truths. Since they're not doing history, this reference with Solomon and the Sanhedrin is not a problem at all. Another disconnect from the original context evident in the Quran is that Jewish tradition frequently refers to various biblical texts to illustrate their meaning. We've already seen some examples of this, and there's a selection from the Talmud with the biblical references in bold. In the Quran, all of this context is lost. This story has become history, an account of how Allah tried Solomon. Let's summarize. We've seen substantial conspicuous parallels between the Quran and Talmud. Muhammad would sweat and snort like a camel to receive revelations already in existence. Many revelations like those in the Quran exist in folklore, legend, and interpretive tradition. The author of the Quran shows no knowledge of the sources the Quran borrows from, and the Quran believes the account of the body placed on Solomon's throne is historical. Let's conclude with one final verse. If you're in doubt about the Quran, then produce a surah, the like thereof, and call upon your witnesses other than Allah. We've done several videos now showing where parts of the Quran come from. Please check the pinned comment for more examples. But whether it's mystical literature, legends, rabbinic tradition, or Jewish and Christian folklore, ultimately the choice is up to you according to the Quran. With all of the parallels that we've seen, have I adequately demonstrated that the Quran is not a divine revelation and that the challenge to produce a surah like it ironically has been met by the traditions that it borrows from? I've called you as my witnesses, and I'll be looking for your verdict in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.